Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we're easing into the strange and deeply unsettling tale of a queen, a king, and a piece of jewellery you'd probably rather not wear. You're settling in, the blankets are pulled up to your chin, and outside the window, the world is quiet. You can hear the gentle creak of the floorboards above you. Or maybe it's just the house settling, a soft sigh in the dark. Now, imagine a cold, stone castle, the wind whistling through the battlements like a forgotten ghost. Inside, a queen sits, not with a diamond necklace or a strand of pearls, but with a locket, and inside that locket, a small, dark object. It's a memento mori, a chilling reminder of death, and a testament to a love so profound it became macabre. The truth is, you probably won't survive this story without a shiver or two, a feeling of unease that will linger long after you've drifted off. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. You can also drop a comment below with your location and local time, so we can feel a little less alone in the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a fly on the wall, flitting through the opulent halls of the House of Savoy in the mid-16th century. It's a time of shifting alliances, of constant war, and of deeply held religious convictions. Our story begins not with a queen on a throne, but with a young duchess, a princess named Margaret of Valois. She's the daughter of a king, King Francis I of France, and the younger sister of the future King Henry II. Born into one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe, she was a true child of the French Renaissance. Now, Margaret isn't the kind of character you see in fairy tales. She wasn't breathtakingly beautiful, or a wilting flower of a princess. She was sharp, witty, and possessed a mind as quick as a falcon's stoop. She loved poetry and was known for her intellectual curiosity, but for all her mental brilliance, her life, like so many noble women of the era, was not entirely her own. She was a pawn on a great chessboard, a piece to be moved for political gain. At 36, an age when most noble women of the time were well past their prime for marriage, Margaret was still single. This wasn't by choice. Her potential marriages had been negotiated and then scuttled for decades due to the political ebb and flow between France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. The years had slipped by, and she was resigned to a life of intellectual pursuits and courtly duties. Then, a new suitor appeared, and the offer was so compelling that her brother, King Henry II, could not refuse. The man in question was Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy. He was a powerful figure, a brilliant military commander known as Testa de Ferro, or Ironhead, for his stoic and unyielding nature on the battlefield. The marriage was part of the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, a monumental agreement that ended the long-running Italian wars between France and the Habsburgs. It was a political marriage, pure and simple, a way to cement peace after decades of bloody conflict. Historians still argue whether Margaret was a willing participant in this arrangement, or if she was simply a dutiful daughter of France, pushed into a union she had little say in. The mainstream historical fact is that she went through with it, and the marriage was scheduled for 1559. It's a grimly fascinating tidbit to remember that this whole arrangement, this new chapter in her life, was being decided upon during a time of immense tragedy. You see, the wedding was set for July 11th, but on July 1st, a mere 10 days before the ceremony, her brother, King Henry II, was fatally wounded in a jousting tournament. An obscure fact, a quirky tidbit you probably won't find in the big history books, is that the lance that pierced his eye belonged to Gabriel Montgomery, the captain of his own Scottish Guard. It was a freak accident, a moment of horror in the middle of what was supposed to be a joyous celebration. Suddenly the great political wedding was thrown into chaos. Margaret's brother lay dying, and a sombre pall had been cast over the entire kingdom. The marriage went ahead, but it was a quiet, private affair held at night, with the guests dressed in mourning clothes. Margaret of Valois was not a bride in a white gown, but a woman in black, a sister grieving her brother even as she took on the role of wife. You can feel the heaviness in the air, the mixture of sadness and duty, a cold rain falling on a parade that had been cancelled before it even began. This was not the joyous beginning to a life you might imagine. Instead, it was a beginning steeped in loss. You can almost hear the soft rustle of her black silk dress as she walked to the altar, the whisper of solemn vows in a room that smelled of death and dried flowers. The story of her life, and the strange object that would define her legacy, was just beginning. It was a new chapter, but one that was already shadowed by the past. You're a guest at this most unusual of weddings, a silent witness to a tragedy already in motion. The air is thick with the scent of lilies and the grim reality of a dying king. Margaret, in her dark gown, walks to her new life with a face composed but a heart surely heavy. The marriage to Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy, was a political masterstroke, a cornerstone of the peace treaty. You can practically hear the whispered relief from the diplomats and nobles, even as they silently mourned their king. But for Margaret, this was the moment her life pivoted from one of quiet scholarship to one of high-stakes court politics and a new, unexpected kind of love. The marriage, for all its sombre beginnings, was a surprising success. Emmanuel Philibert was a warrior, a man of action, but he was also a man of deep respect and affection for his new wife. He was, to put it mildly, smitten. He found in Margaret an intellectual equal, a woman whose mind could match his own. You might imagine him, a gruff military man, finding a surprising kind of peace in her company, listening to her witty observations and sharp insights. Their connection deepened quickly, moving from a political arrangement to a genuine partnership. He listened to her counsel and valued her opinions, a rare thing for a royal consort of that era. She, in turn, found a great deal of comfort and affection in this man of iron. She had been passed over for so long, and now she had a husband who saw her not as a pawn, but as a queen. The royal couple's happiness was a fleeting, luminous thing, a candle burning brightly against a backdrop of European turmoil. Within a year of their marriage, she gave birth to a son, Charles Emmanuel, securing the dynasty and cementing her place in the House of Savoy. Their lives were an intricate tapestry of diplomacy, war, and quiet domesticity. They moved between their various castles and estates, governing their lands, and in a quirky historical tidbit that isn't widely known, Emmanuel Philibert was a passionate botanist. He established a vast botanical garden in Turin, a small oasis of peace and study for a man so used to the chaos of war. He would, on occasion, even send specimens and seeds to his wife from his campaigns, a strange and gentle gesture for such a fearsome commander. Their time together was marked by an almost constant motion. They were not cloistered in a single court, but travelled extensively, visiting their various duchies and forging connections. This perpetual movement, however, meant they were exposed to the many health hazards of the 16th century. Life was fragile, and even the most powerful could be felled by a simple fever or a rogue illness. And so, in the spring of 1580, the serene rhythm of their lives was shattered. Emmanuel Philibert fell ill with a fever. It was a common occurrence, a small hiccup in the otherwise powerful constitution of a man who had survived countless battles. But this time, it was different. The fever held, growing more tenacious with each passing day. Margaret, a woman who had already weathered so much loss, found herself on the precipice of another great sorrow. She was his devoted nurse, staying by his side, tending to him, praying for his recovery. The royal physicians were, for all their pomp and powdered wigs, powerless. The Duke's condition worsened. The mainstream historical fact here is that Emmanuel Philibert died in Turin on August the 30th, 1580. His death was a monumental event, not just for his family but for all of Europe. He had been a key player in the political landscape for decades, and his passing created a void. For Margaret, it was a tragedy of unimaginable scale. The love she had found, the solace she had been given was now gone. Her partner, her confidant, the man who had seen past her age and her politics to find her spirit, was no more. The grief that consumed her was not the polite public grief of a queen, but the raw, visceral agony of a woman who had lost her great love. Historians still argue whether her grief was a display of genuine, heartfelt emotion or a carefully cultivated performance to secure her position as regent for her young son. The reality, perhaps, is a messy combination of both. You can almost feel the cold shock of it, the world tilting on its axis. One moment, a hand to hold, the next, an empty space where he used to be. It was in this deep well of sorrow that Margaret began to make a series of profoundly unusual decisions. She couldn't bear to let him go completely. The thought of his body being buried and his presence vanishing from her life was intolerable. She had to have a piece of him, a physical token of their time together. Her decision was not born of rationality, but of a desperate, all-consuming need. You see, the tradition of embalming was not uncommon for royalty, But what Margaret would ask for was far from the norm. She sought not just to preserve his body for burial, but to possess a part of him for herself, a final, tangible connection that the grave could not take from her. It was this act, born of a grieving widow's love and desperation, that would set her on the path to becoming the queen with a dead man's heart. The story of how she acquired it, and the strange journey it would take, is a tale so bizarre it can only be true. It's a testament to the fact that even in the grand corridors of power, love and loss can drive people to the most extraordinary and unsettling of acts. And for Margaret, the journey had only just begun. The news of Emmanuel Philibert's death must have rippled across Europe like a stone dropped in a placid lake, sending out shockwaves that destabilized alliances and reshaped the balance of power. You can feel the tension in the air, a silent scramble for advantage. For Margaret, however, the political manoeuvring was a distant hum, a mosquito she was too consumed by grief to swat away. She had a more personal, more pressing crisis to attend to. You're watching as her grief transforms into a formidable, almost terrifying resolve. It was here, in the darkest hour, that the seeds of a profound betrayal were sown. Margaret was not without her enemies, and the Duke's sudden death presented a golden opportunity for those who wished to usurp her influence and control the young heir, her son Charles Emmanuel. The serpent in the garden was not a single person, but rather a collective of ambitious courtiers and political rivals who saw a grieving widow as a weak link. The mainstream historical fact is that upon Emmanuel Philibert's death, his son Charles Emmanuel I, a boy of only 18, inherited the title of Duke of Savoy. But as was often the case with young monarchs, the power behind the throne was more important than the one on it. Margaret, as the Dowager Duchess and mother of the new Duke, was the natural choice for regent. But her late husband's court was a viper's nest of intrigue. You can almost see the shadowy figures huddled in corners, whispering, their eyes darting towards Margaret's chambers. They were nobles who had lost favour under the Duke's rule, ambitious relatives who believed they had a better claim to influence, and even foreign spies working to destabilise the House of Savoy. They saw her profound grief not as a sign of love, but as a weakness to be exploited. A quirky tidbit is that one of the most prominent of these schemers was a distant cousin of her late husband, a man who had long resented Emmanuel Philibert's power and his French alliance. This man was known for his love of ornate poisons, which he would reportedly test on small animals kept in secret cages in his study. The court was rife with such dark, insidious characters. As Margaret began to make her plans for her husband's funeral and her macabre request, the whispers grew louder. They painted her as a woman unhinged by grief, a liability to the duchy. They spoke of her French heritage with derision, suggesting she was a French puppet who would steer Savoy away from its rightful alliances. Historians still argue whether the conspiracy against Margaret was a well-organised plot with a clear leader, or a more diffuse network of opportunistic individuals, each with their own agenda. Either way, the effect was the same, a steady erosion of her authority at a time when she needed it most. You can feel her isolation, the chilling realization that she could not trust anyone. The very people who had professed loyalty to her husband were now subtly undermining her at every turn. In this climate of suspicion and betrayal, Margaret's resolve hardened. She had to act swiftly and decisively to secure her place and her son's future. She knew that her request, to have her husband's heart removed and given to her, would be seen as further proof of her instability, so she had to operate in secret. This required a level of cunning and political savvy that few would have expected from a woman so visibly consumed by sorrow. She began to forge a small, loyal inner circle, a handful of trusted servants and a single physician she had known for years. They were her quiet army in a court full of spies. She would meet with them in a small, unadorned room away from the main halls of the palace, using coded language and gestures to avoid suspicion. She was no longer just the grieving widow. She was a strategist, a queen fighting for her very survival. The conspiracy was in full swing, even as the embalmers began their solemn work on the Duke's body. The conspirators, confident in their ability to manipulate the young Duke, were already making plans to have Margaret removed from any position of power, perhaps even sent back to France under some flimsy pretext. They were so consumed with their own machinations that they failed to see the strength beneath Margaret's sorrow. They saw a woman mourning a man. They did not see a queen preparing for war. They were like the serpent in the garden, so sure of their cleverness that they didn't realise they were about to be outsmarted by the very person they sought to destroy. And so, as the plot thickened and the whispers grew into a steady hum, Margaret's own counterplan was already in motion. Her path was one of secrecy and defiance, a journey that would lead her to commit an act that would define her legacy and forever bind her to the memory of her late husband. But before she could do that, she had to secure the loyalty of the one man who would be tasked with the most delicate and gruesome part of her plan. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the final act was about to begin. You can almost hear the soft, sinister rustle of silk as the conspirators congratulate themselves, oblivious to the fact that they were walking straight into a trap. Margaret's grief was not a weakness. It was a weapon. The palace in Turin, once a hub of bustling political life, now feels like a tomb. You're a ghost gliding down the long corridors, the tapestries on the walls heavy with the silence of mourning. The air is cold, and the only sounds are the muted shuffling of servants and the low, constant hum of whispered conspiracies. Margaret of Valois has locked herself away, not just to grieve, but to plan. The first step of her plan, the one that would define her legacy, had to be carried out with the utmost secrecy and precision. She couldn't risk the official embalmers, who were likely in the pay of her rivals, learning of her intentions. This required a private, almost ceremonial act, one that would take place away from the prying eyes of the court. You feel a chill as you realise the extent of her desperation and resolve. The mainstream historical fact here is that the practice of separating the heart and other organs from the body for separate burial or preservation was not uncommon for royalty during this period. The cor cordium, or heart of hearts, was often interred in a separate chapel or abbey, a sign of devotion and piety. However, a quirky tidbit is that this was almost always a public affair, a solemn procession to a designated sacred place. Margaret's plan was different. She wasn't seeking to place her husband's heart in a consecrated space. She was seeking to possess it for herself. This was a private act of devotion, a macabre and deeply personal choice that went against the prevailing public customs of the time. The ceremony she would orchestrate would be a quiet, clandestine affair, a secret that she would carry for the rest of her life. Her chosen confidant for this grisly task was an old, trusted family physician named Dr. Antoine. He was a man of medicine, not of politics, and he had served her family for decades. He was also, a fringe historical tidbit notes, a man with a fascination for human anatomy, who had a small collection of preserved animal hearts in his private study. Margaret called him to a small private chapel within the palace, a place where the air was still and the shadows were deep. She laid out her request simply, without emotion. She needed him to embalm the Duke's body, as per the custom, but with one crucial hidden addition. He was to perform a separate secret incision and remove the Duke's heart. He was to clean and preserve it, not for public display, but for her. You can see the flicker of shock in the doctor's eyes, followed by a look of deep compassion for the grieving queen. He knew the request was both morbid and dangerous, but he could not refuse the woman who had been his kind and gentle mistress for so long. Historians still argue whether Dr. Antoine performed the procedure with the full knowledge of its intended use, or if he simply followed the Queen's orders without question, assuming she would eventually have it interred in a royal tomb. The fact remains that he did what she asked. The scene that follows is one of stark, chilling beauty. In the dead of night, with only a few trusted servants to stand watch, the doctor began his grim work. You can almost smell the strong scent of the embalming spices, cinnamon, myrrh, frankincense, and the cold, sterile air of the chapel. The body of the Duke lay on a stone slab, his face peaceful in death. The doctor worked with a solemn, practised hand, his movements precise and efficient. He made the initial incisions, beginning the process of preserving the Duke's form for posterity. Then, in a moment of utter stillness, he made the secondary discreet incision. He reached into the chest cavity, and with a reverence that belied the gruesomeness of the task, he lifted out the organ. You can almost hear the soft, sickening sound of it being removed. The heart was then placed in a small, ornate silver casket, not much larger than a jewel box. The doctor then sealed the casket and handed it to Margaret. The weight of it in her hands must have felt immense, both in its physical form and its symbolic meaning. She took the heart, And then she did something completely unexpected. She didn't return to her chambers. Instead, she went to a secluded corner of the chapel, and she knelt. With the small silver casket clutched to her chest, she began to pray. She prayed not for her husband's soul, but for her own, and for the strength to carry the burden of her grief and the power she now held. The secret ceremony was a success. The Duke's body was prepared for a grand state funeral, and no one was the wiser. The conspirators, busy with their own plans, never suspected what had been taken from the Duke, or what the Queen now held. She had a piece of her husband, a tangible connection to the love she'd lost, but the heart was a dangerous object. It was a secret she would have to guard with her life, a relic that could be used against her if it were ever discovered. And so, with her husband's heart in her possession, she began the next phase of her strange and lonely journey. You watch as she rises, the silver box clasped tightly in her hands, her face a mask of determination and grief. The Queen had her heart, and the stage was set for the next act. You're a fly on the wall, and the world is holding its breath. The funeral of Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy, is a grand, sombre affair. The bells of Turin toll with a funereal cadence, and the streets are lined with silent, grieving subjects. The ducal coffin, resplendent with royal insignia, is borne on the shoulders of his loyal guard. No one but Margaret and her trusted physician know that it is missing its most vital piece. Margaret, veiled in black, walks behind the coffin, her head bowed in a seemingly conventional display of grief. But in her chambers, a small silver casket holds the most precious and macabre of relics. The secrecy surrounding the heart's removal was one thing. Its transport to a safe and permanent location was quite another. This was a treacherous business, a clandestine journey that would take the heart on a path fraught with danger and intrigue. The mainstream historical fact is that the Duke's body was interred in the Basilica of Superga, a grand mausoleum for the House of Savoy. But as his body was laid to rest, his heart was about to embark on its own secret pilgrimage. Margaret's plan was meticulous. She could not, of course, be seen carrying the casket herself. It had to be entrusted to someone so far above suspicion they would be completely overlooked. She chose a small, unassuming man, a trusted chamberlain who had served her family for years. He was not a courtier, not a diplomat, but a simple, loyal servant whose face blended into the crowd. A quirky tidbit is that she disguised the casket as a small ornate prayer book, a personal object that he was to carry at all times. The man, a devout Catholic, thought nothing of it, believing he was carrying a holy relic for his queen. The real relic, however, was far more personal and profoundly human. The journey was not a simple one. To get to her most secure and private residence, a small and secluded villa on the outskirts of Turin, the chamberlain had to travel through several contested territories, past rival duchies, and along roads notorious for bandits. He travelled by night, hiding the prayer book under his simple cloak during the day, sleeping in rough inns where no one would look at a man twice. You can feel the tension of the journey, the constant fear of discovery. Every sound in the dark, every approaching shadow on the road must have sent a shiver of fear down his spine. He was carrying not just a king's heart, but the secret of a queen. The fate of the entire House of Savoy, or so he believed, rested on his ability to keep this secret safe. Meanwhile, back at the court, the political intrigue was reaching a fever pitch. Her rivals, assuming she was a grieving wreck, were preparing to make their move. They were convinced that with the Duke's death, the powerful bond between Savoy and France was at an end. They believed they could easily manipulate the young Duke, Charles Emmanuel, who was still finding his footing as a ruler. They saw Margaret's public mourning as a display of weakness. They didn't realise it was a shield, a cover for her true intentions. This is a point that historians still argue. Was Margaret's public display of grief a calculated political move, a strategic performance to lull her enemies into a false sense of security, or was it a genuine, all-consuming sorrow that simply provided a convenient screen for her macabre plan? The reality is likely a mix of both. Grief can be a powerful motivator, and it can also be an excellent disguise. As the days turned into weeks, the chamberlain made his way slowly and surely towards the villa. He had no idea what he was carrying, only that it was a secret entrusted to him by his queen. When he finally arrived, Margaret met him herself, alone, at the gates. She didn't speak. She simply took the prayer book from his hands, her fingers brushing over the cold silver. She then instructed him to take a long, extended leave, with a generous sum of money, and never speak of this journey to anyone. The man, bewildered but loyal, simply bowed and left, disappearing back into the quiet anonymity from which he came, and so, the heart of Emmanuel Philibert was finally home. Margaret had a small, secret room built within the secluded villa, a private sanctuary away from the main palace. It was in this room that she would keep the casket. It was not a place for visitors, or for public mourning. It was a private space, a testament to a love that had defied convention. The casket was placed on a small velvet-draped table, a single candle burning beside it, a vigil that would last for the rest of her life. The macabre journey was complete, and the Queen had her heart. This act, born of a deep and personal grief, would become the defining eccentricity of her reign. She had a piece of him, a constant, tangible reminder of the love that had been her solace. But this was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning of her life as the Queen with a dead man's heart. You're standing in a quiet, sunlit room, a world away from the cold stone of the palace. The scent of beeswax and old wood hangs in the air. This is Margaret's private sanctuary, the room where the small silver casket rests on a table. The casket itself is a work of art, with intricate carvings and what appear to be tiny embedded jewels. But as you get closer, you realise they aren't gems at all, but rather meticulously arranged pieces of polished bone and fragments of Emmanuel Philibert's favourite military medals, melted down and reformed into delicate filigree. A quirky, unsettling detail that speaks volumes about her all-consuming sorrow. The casket is, for all intents and purposes, her most prized possession. She spends hours in this room, sitting in a chair, simply staring at it. Her grief, as you've come to understand, is not a simple, passive emotion. It is a creative force, a powerful impetus that finds its expression in strange and beautiful ways. This is where her jewel box of grieving comes into play. It's not a literal box, but a collection of mementos, each one a testament to her lost love. She begins to collect anything and everything that reminds her of Emmanuel Philibert. She has her scribes meticulously copy his letters to her, even the most mundane ones about military campaigns or the weather. She has his favourite horse, a magnificent white stallion, kept in a special paddock, tended to by a single groom, and she visits it daily, stroking its mane and whispering to it as if it were an old friend. She commissions a series of tapestries that depict their life together, from their first meeting to their wedding, but in each one, her husband is shown as a powerful, larger-than-life figure, almost a mythical hero. The real-life, mainstream historical fact is that she did indeed commission a series of tapestries, now housed in the Palazzo Madama in Turin, that were considered highly unusual for their time due to their intensely personal and almost hagiographic nature. They are not grand, triumphant depictions of battles, but intimate scenes of court life and domestic bliss. As her grief deepens, her collection of relics becomes even more personal and macabre. She has the sword he carried in battle, a heavy worn blade with end notches on its edge, polished and displayed in a velvet-lined case. She has her seamstresses recreate his favourite outfits, down to the last button, and she keeps them in a special wardrobe, refusing to let anyone touch them. A fascinating, if slightly unsettling tidbit is that she reportedly had one of his gauntlets, a heavy metal glove he wore in battle, mounted on a stand on her bedside table. At night, before she went to sleep, she would place her hand inside it, a cold, empty echo of the hand she used to hold. Historians still argue whether this was a ritual of mourning or a deeply superstitious act. Was she simply finding comfort in these objects, or did she believe they still held a piece of her husband's spirit? The truth, of course, is probably somewhere in the middle. Her collection is not a secret. The court whispers about it. Her rivals, still plotting, see this as further proof of her instability. They call her the Queen of Shadows, and her villa the House of Mourning. They fail to understand the difference between public grieving and personal sorrow. For Margaret, this was not a performance. It was a coping mechanism, a way to anchor herself in a world that had become unmoored by his death. She could not bring him back, but she could surround herself with his memory, to the point where it was almost as if he were still there. She was a woman who was living in the past, a ghost in her own kingdom, and yet, despite her all-consuming grief, she was still a queen. She still had a son to raise and a duchy to rule. She would leave her private sanctuary to attend to her royal duties, her face a mask of serene composure. She would listen to the counsel of her advisers, meet with foreign dignitaries, and make decisions that would shape the future of Savoy. But as soon as her duties were done, she would retreat back to her villa, back to her collection of relics, and back to the small silver casket. Her two worlds, the world of power and the world of private mourning, existed side by side, never touching, yet constantly influencing one another. You can feel the sharp dichotomy, the tension between the queen and the widow. She was a woman torn in two, a ruler who lived for her people, and a woman who lived for her dead husband. The heart in the casket was not just a relic, it was a symbol of this division, a physical manifestation of her broken heart. This collection, this jewel box of grieving, was a monument to a love that had ended too soon, a love that would continue to define her and her kingdom for the rest of her life. The silence in Margaret's villa is a stark contrast to the growing tumult outside its walls. While she meticulously curates her grief and tends to her morbid collection, the kingdom she now governs is on a knife's edge. The death of Emmanuel Philibert has not only created a vacuum of power, but has also reignited old rivalries and sowed seeds of discontent among the populace. You can feel the unease in the air, a low constant thrum of anxiety that is palpable even in the grandest of palaces. The people of Savoy, once united under their brilliant military leader, are now faced with a young, untested duke and a foreign-born queen who seems to spend more time with a dead man's heart than with her living subjects. The mainstream historical fact is that the rule of her son, Charles Emmanuel I, began under a shadow of political instability. He was young and easily influenced, and his regency was a turbulent period marked by internal conflict and external threats. Her rivals, who had failed to dislodge her from power directly, began to work on a more subtle, insidious front. They started to sow dissent among the nobles and the common people, painting Margaret as an out-of-touch, melancholic ruler who had no interest in the welfare of her kingdom. They pointed to her retreat into mourning as proof of her unsuitability to guide the state. They whispered of her French ways and her disinterest in the true spirit of Savoy. This propaganda was surprisingly effective, fueled by a populace that had grown weary of constant warfare and was looking for a scapegoat. A quirky tidbit is that these rivals even circulated pamphlets and broadsides that depicted Margaret as a kind of spectral figure, a ghost queen, haunted by the spirit of her dead husband and unwilling to engage with the living world. The pamphlets were crudely drawn, but their message was powerful, tapping into the superstitious fears of the common people. You can see the effects of this political manoeuvring everywhere. The streets of Turin are no longer as vibrant. The market squares are filled with sullen faces. There is a sense of stagnation, as if the kingdom is holding its breath. The conspirators, you realise, are not just targeting Margaret, they're targeting her son's legitimacy. By undermining her, they're casting doubt on his ability to rule. They're creating a climate of fear and distrust, where any decision made by the Queen or the young Duke is immediately questioned and criticised. They argue, in hushed tones, that the kingdom needs a strong, decisive leader, not a grief-stricken widow and her inexperienced son. Historians still argue whether Margaret was truly as disengaged as her critics claimed, or if she was a shrewd ruler who, by her very withdrawal, created a space for her son to grow into his role without her overshadowing him. The reality is likely a mix of both. She was, without a doubt, a grieving woman, but she was also a very intelligent and politically savvy queen. She knew that any overt display of power would be seen as an attempt to usurp her son's authority, so she chose a more subtle, passive approach. She listened, she observed, and she gave her son the space to make his own decisions, even if they were mistakes. She was a silent guardian, a veil over the kingdom, watching and waiting. In this climate of unrest, Margaret began to subtly and secretly consolidate her own power. She did not engage in public debates or issue fiery edicts. Instead, she used her network of trusted servants and spies to gather intelligence. She knew who was loyal and who was not. She would, in the dead of night, send out trusted couriers with letters to foreign courts, securing alliances that her rivals knew nothing about. She was a master of the silent game, a queen who worked in the shadows. She knew that her public persona as a grieving widow was both a vulnerability and a strength. It made her seem harmless, easy to manipulate, but in reality it allowed her to move unseen, to wield influence without anyone suspecting it. The kingdom was under a veil, a thin layer of polite society that hid a seething cauldron of ambition and betrayal. The conspirators, so focused on their elaborate plots, failed to see that the woman they were targeting was not a fragile flower, but a steel-willed queen who had survived the court of Francis I. She had learned the Game of Thrones long ago, and she was an expert at it. Her withdrawal was not a surrender, it was a retreat to a more defensible position. From her quiet villa, with her morbid collection of relics, she was quietly pulling the strings, a puppet master working in the dark. The Ghost Queen was not a ghost at all, she was very much alive and she was watching, and she would do whatever it took to protect her son and her kingdom. The kingdom was under a veil, and Margaret was the weaver. The kingdom of Savoy is no longer just under a veil of mourning, it's now shrouded in a thick fog of suspicion and fear. You can feel it in the air, a subtle shift from political intrigue to something far more sinister. The whispers that once centred on Margaret's competence as a ruler have now taken on a much darker tone. They're no longer about her French heritage or her grief. They're about her connection to the supernatural, to the dark arts, to black magic. The grief-stricken queen is no longer just an object of pity or scorn. She's becoming a figure of terror and dread. The mainstream historical fact here is that the 16th century was a deeply superstitious time. The fear of witchcraft and sorcery was widespread, fueled by religious zealotry and a general lack of scientific understanding. The Protestant Reformation was in full swing, and both Catholics and Protestants were on the lookout for signs of demonic influence. In this climate, a woman who retreated from public life and kept a strange macabre object in her private chambers was ripe for suspicion. Margaret's rivals, quick to capitalise on this popular fear, began to spread rumours about her. They didn't have to be loud. A simple, well-placed whisper was enough. They spoke of her nightly vigils in the villa, of the strange flickering candlelight seen through her windows, and of the powerful hold she seemed to have over her son, the Duke. They suggested that she was not just mourning her husband, but communing with his spirit, using his preserved heart as a focus for her spells. A quirky, almost unbelievable tidbit is that one of her most vocal detractors, a courtier who had been secretly trying to arrange a marriage for the young Duke to a Spanish princess, spread a rumour that Margaret had a pact with the devil. He claimed that the heart she possessed was not her husband's at all, but a demonic replacement, a conduit for evil. He even went so far as to create a small macabre figurine with a tiny replica of the casket she kept, and had it left on the doorstep of several prominent nobles. It was a vicious and baseless attack, but it was effective. The common people already on edge began to look at her with fear. Mothers would pull their children away from her carriage as it passed, and servants would whisper about her in the kitchens, crossing themselves as they spoke her name. Historians still argue whether Margaret was aware of the extent of these rumours. Did she know that her grief was being twisted into something so monstrous? Or was she too consumed by her sorrow and her private world to care? It is likely that she was aware, at least to some degree. She was a politically astute woman, and she had a network of spies and informants. She would have known that the populace was becoming restless, and she would have heard the whispers. But she chose not to engage with them. She did not issue public denials or try to prove her innocence. Her silence, in the eyes of her enemies, was proof of her guilt. She was a woman who had been raised in the very centre of power, and she had learned that sometimes the best response is no response at all. To acknowledge the rumours would be to give them legitimacy. So she simply carried on, a silent figure of sorrow and strength, while the kingdom around her descended into a maelstrom of fear and superstition. The fear of witchcraft was a powerful tool, and it was being used to perfection against her. Her rivals hoped that the young Duke, who was devoutly religious, would be swayed by these rumours and cast her out. But they underestimated the bond between mother and son. Charles Emmanuel, for all his youth and inexperience, was devoted to his mother. He had seen her grief, and he knew it was genuine. He dismissed the rumours as the work of desperate men. He did not, however, go so far as to publicly defend her, a small detail that historians often overlook. He was a king in a precarious position, and he could not afford to align himself too closely with a figure who was becoming so controversial. He was, in essence, walking a very fine line. He was her son, her ally, but he was also the Duke, and he had to protect his own interests. So while Margaret continued her private rituals, the outside world grew darker and more hostile. The Ghost Queen was now being called the Sorceress Queen. Her retreat was not seen as a sign of mourning, but as a sign of her alienation from God. The heart in the silver box was not a symbol of love, but a talisman of evil. It was a tragic and deeply unfair transformation of her public image, a complete distortion of her personal sorrow. But in the 16th century, truth was often less important than perception, and the perception of Margaret of Valois was changing, from a grief-stricken widow to a figure of fear, a queen who wore a dead man's heart not as a sign of love but as a tool of black magic. The whispers of witchcraft and the fear of the public, once a distant hum, are now a roar. Margaret, however, remains in her quiet villa, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing outside. You watch as her grief takes on a new, unsettling dimension. It's no longer just about mourning the past. It's about preparing for the future, her own future, in a way that is just as macabre and unconventional as her preservation of her husband's heart. Her sorrow has become a long, slow process of preparation for her own death, a final act of devotion to the man she loved. The mainstream historical fact is that noble and royal figures of this period often made meticulous plans for their funerals and burials, commissioning elaborate tombs and writing detailed wills. This was a way of controlling their legacy and ensuring their memory would endure. But Margaret's preparations were far from conventional. A quirky tidbit is that she began a quiet private project. She started to commission the construction of a series of small, exquisitely crafted caskets, each one a different design and material. She was not just commissioning a single casket for herself, she was commissioning a collection of them, a chillingly beautiful set of final resting places. She would pore over the designs, giving the master craftsman detailed instructions, specifying the type of wood, the metal for the fittings, and the type of lining. One casket, it is said, was made of ebony and lined with a rich crimson velvet, a stark contrast to the black she wore. Another was made of a light pale wood, adorned with silver inlay and a simple cross. Historians still argue whether this was a sign of a deeply troubled mind, a morbid obsession with death, or if it was a final, artistic expression of her grief. Was she simply a woman who had come to terms with her own mortality in a very personal way, or was she descending into madness? The truth is, it was likely a bit of both. The constant presence of her husband's heart and her deep, abiding sorrow had undoubtedly changed her. But her preparations were not just for herself. She also had a special hidden compartment built into the wall of her private chapel, a niche that was only accessible to her and her most trusted confidant. It was here that she planned to place her husband's heart when her own time came, a final, secret resting place where they could be together for eternity. She was not just preparing to die, she was preparing for a reunion. Her preparations were a stark contrast to the political turmoil outside. The young Duke, Charles Emmanuel, was struggling to assert his authority in the face of so many rivals. He was a brilliant man, but he was also prone to rash decisions and fits of temper. He would often turn to his mother for counsel, and she would, in her quiet way, guide him through the maze of court politics. She was still a powerful force, even from her seclusion. But her influence was subtle, almost invisible. She would send him notes with carefully worded advice, or she would arrange for meetings with foreign dignitaries without his rivals knowing. She was a silent partner, a guiding hand from the shadows. She knew that her public persona as a grief-stricken widow was her best weapon, and she used it to perfection. As she worked on her caskets and her private funeral plans, she was also, in her own way, preparing her son for her absence. She was teaching him to be a king, to trust his own instincts, and to be wary of those who professed loyalty. She was passing on the hard-won lessons of a life lived in the crucible of power. The irony, of course, is that she was doing this even as the kingdom was beginning to see her as a dangerous, unhinged figure. She was preparing for her own death while fighting to secure her son's legacy. It was a strange and deeply sad duality, a queen who lived for her family and a woman who was slowly, deliberately, fading away. The final casket she commissioned was the most personal of all. It was small, unadorned, and made of simple, unvarnished pine. It was to be her final resting place, a humble box to hold the body of a queen who had everything but chose to live in a world of grief. She had a single instruction for this casket. It was to be buried with her, but it was to be placed not at her head but over her heart, a physical manifestation of her enduring love. It was a final, beautiful and heartbreaking gesture. She was a woman who had lived a life of immense power and profound sorrow, and her end would be a reflection of both. She was not just planning a funeral, she was writing the final chapter of her story, a story that began with a political marriage and would end with a quiet, lonely coffin. The quiet rhythm of Margaret's grief and her meticulous preparations for death is a stark contrast to the unfolding drama of her son's reign. You're no longer just a ghost in the palace. You're a witness to the slow, agonizing transformation of a kingdom. Margaret's profound, enduring sorrow and the macabre object that symbolized it were not just personal eccentricities, they were a legacy that would shape her son's rule and the future of the House of Savoy. The heart in the silver casket and the Queen's devotion to it had a lasting, tangible effect on the political landscape of Europe. The mainstream historical fact is that the young Duke, Charles Emmanuel I, grew into his role as a ruler, but he never quite escaped the shadow of his mother's grief. He was a brilliant military strategist, much like his father, but he was also prone to fits of grandiosity and a love of extravagant displays. A quirky tidbit is that he reportedly would not make any major military or political decision without first consulting with his mother, even if it was just to hear her calm, measured voice. He would often ride to her secluded villa in the dead of night, slipping past his own guards, just to have a private audience with her. He would sit with her in her private sanctuary, the very room where the heart rested, and he would unburden himself of the pressures of his rule. The presence of the casket and the profound sadness it represented was a constant, unspoken reminder of the fragility of life and the fleeting nature of power. This strange nocturnal ritual became a cornerstone of his reign. Historians still argue whether Margaret's grief was a positive or negative influence on her son. Did it make him more cautious and thoughtful, or did it make him more reckless, a man who was desperately trying to live up to the impossible legacy of his father, a hero who now existed only in the form of a preserved heart? It is likely that her influence was a mix of both. On the one hand, her quiet wisdom and her deep understanding of European politics often saved him from making terrible mistakes. She was a master of diplomacy, a chess player who could see 10 moves ahead. On the other hand, her constant, unyielding grief likely cast a pall over his reign. He was a son who could never fully escape the sorrow of his mother, a king who was constantly reminded that his kingdom was built on the foundation of a broken heart. The legacy of the broken heart also manifested itself in Charles Emmanuel's own persona. He was a man obsessed with legacy and immortality. He began to commission vast public works, from grand palaces to ornate cathedrals, as if to prove that he was more than just his father's son. He was a man who, you might imagine, was haunted by the fact that a piece of his father was not in a grand tomb, but in a small casket in a secret room. He was driven to create a legacy so grand and so permanent that it would overshadow the personal, macabre one his mother had created. He wanted to be a king of stone and steel, not of grief and memory. This obsessive need to prove himself led to a series of military campaigns and political blunders that would define his reign. He was constantly at war, not just with foreign powers, but with his own internal demons. He was a man who, a fringe historical tidbit notes, would often spend hours in the Grand Basilica where his father's body lay, but would never mention his mother's private relic. He was a king who was publicly honouring his father's body while his mother was privately honouring his heart. The kingdom was, in a way, divided in its mourning, a private sorrow in a public space, a public display of grief in a private one. And so, the legacy of a broken heart became the legacy of a tumultuous reign. The young king, under the quiet, profound influence of his grieving mother, was trying to find his own way, to create his own identity. But he was always, in a way, still tied to her, and to the macabre object she held so dear. The heart was not just a symbol of love, it was a psychological and political force that would shape the future of a dynasty. It was a reminder that even in the grandest halls of power, the personal can become profoundly political, and a broken heart can leave a legacy that lasts for generations. The court of Charles Emmanuel I is a strange place. A world where the living and the dead seem to coexist in an unsettling harmony. You're a fly on the wall, and you can't help but feel a sense of unease. The air is thick with a melancholy that seems to emanate from the very heart of the royal family. While Margaret of Valois has retreated to her private villa, Her influence is still very much felt, and her grief has created a kind of court of its own, a silent world of spectres and shadows. The people who surround the young Duke are not just courtiers and advisors, they are characters straight out of a Gothic novel, each one a product of the strange atmosphere of sorrow and devotion that now permeates the royal family. The mainstream historical fact here is that Margaret's grief and her macabre relic became a kind of informal test of loyalty. Those who wished to gain favour with her and her son would feign a deep and abiding respect for the deceased Duke. They would talk in hushed tones about his greatness, and they would often make subtle, deferential gestures towards his portrait or his personal effects. This created a court where sincerity was less important than performance. A quirky, unsettling tidbit is that a number of courtiers began to mimic Margaret's style of mourning. They would wear a small black ribbon, not just for a few months, but for years. One courtier, a minor noble who was desperately trying to curry favour with the young Duke, even reportedly commissioned a sculpture of a single, withered rose, a symbol of their enduring sorrow for the late Duke. The court became a stage for a morbid, unending play of grief. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine expression of a shared mourning or a cynical manipulation of a grieving family. The reality, of course, is that it was likely a mix of both. There were undoubtedly those who genuinely mourned the Duke, but there were also those who saw his death as an opportunity. They saw Margaret's devotion not as a sign of love, but as a weakness to be exploited. They would praise her unwavering loyalty, but in private they would mock her as the Queen of Graves. The court was a place where words had two meanings, where every gesture was a carefully calculated performance. You can almost feel the falseness in the air, a kind of suffocating politeness that masked a seething cauldron of ambition and deceit. The young Duke, Charles Emmanuel, was a product of this strange environment. He had grown up with a mother who lived in the past, and a court that lived in a perpetual state of mourning. He was a man who, you might imagine, was desperately trying to escape the shadow of his father. He was a flamboyant and ambitious man, a lover of art and music, but his grandiosity was always tinged with a deep, abiding sadness. He was a king who was constantly trying to prove himself, not just to his people, but to his mother and to the memory of his father. He would, a fringe historical tidbit notes, often commission portraits of himself in heroic poses, in the style of Roman emperors, a stark contrast to the quiet, dignified portraits of his father that hung in his mother's villa. The court became a reflection of the Duke's and his mother's complex psychology. It was a place of grand feasts and lavish balls, but it was also a place where a quiet, sombre tone was always present. It was a place where life was celebrated, but death was never far from people's minds. Margaret, from her secluded villa, was the silent force behind all of this. She had created a world that was a reflection of her own internal landscape, a world where the past was always present and where the dead were never truly gone. The royal court was, in a way, her personal memorial, a living testament to her enduring love for her husband. The courtiers were not just people, they were the actors in her play, a cast of spectres and shadows, each one playing a part in the royal court of a grieving queen. And in the centre of it all, a young king was trying to find his own way, a son caught between the grand, ambitious world he was trying to create and the quiet, sorrowful world his mother had built. You're a silent observer in the court of Savoy, and what you see is a paradox. On the surface, the young Duke, Charles Emmanuel I, is the sole ruler, a man of grand ambitions and public pronouncements. He is the sun in the kingdom's sky. But if you look closely, you can see the faint shadow of an unseen hand, a power that works not in the light of day, but in the deep of night. That hand belongs to Margaret of Valois, the grieving queen who has retreated from public life, but who has not for a single moment relinquished her hold on power. Her influence is a quiet, steady current that runs beneath the surface of court politics, and it is a testament to her intelligence and her understanding of human nature. The mainstream historical fact is that the regency for Charles Emmanuel I officially ended when he came of age, but Margaret continued to act as his most trusted advisor, a role that was both unofficial and profoundly powerful. A quirky tidbit is that she would often use her network of trusted spies and informants to gather intelligence on her son's rivals, not by listening to their conversations, but by observing their habits and their interactions with their families. She believed that a person's true nature was revealed not in a public forum but in the privacy of their home. She would receive detailed reports on who was arguing with their wife, who was spending too much money, and who was secretly corresponding with foreign powers. She was a master of the silent game, and she used this information to guide her son's decisions, often without him even knowing the true source of her knowledge. Historians still argue whether Charles Emmanuel was a willful participant in this arrangement, or if he was simply a naive young man who was completely under his mother's thumb. The reality, of course, is far more complex. He was a man who had grown up in the shadow of his brilliant father and his powerful mother. He had witnessed the instability that followed his father's death, and he had a deep-seated fear of making a mistake that would jeopardize his reign. He relied on his mother, not just for her wisdom, but for her emotional support. She was his confidant, the one person he could trust implicitly, in a court filled with opportunists and traitors. He would, in a fringe historical tidbit, often send her coded letters, not about state affairs, but about his own fears and anxieties, his struggles with his nobles, and his doubts about his own abilities. He was a king who was publicly confident, but privately terrified, and his mother was the only person who truly understood him. Margaret's power was not just based on her intellect, it was also based on her a persona as a grieving widow. Her seclusion, which her enemies saw as a sign of weakness, was in fact a shield. By staying out of the public eye, she avoided direct political confrontation. She could influence her son's decisions without taking the credit or the blame. She was a shadow ruler, a ghost in the machine, and her very absence from the court made her all the more powerful. Her rivals, so focused on the young duke, completely overlooked the quiet, unassuming woman who was pulling the strings from her secluded villa. They were like a pack of dogs barking at a shadow, completely unaware of the hand that was feeding them. The heart in the silver casket, the silent, macabre object in her private sanctuary, was, in a way, the source of her power. It was a constant reminder of the life she had lost and the love that had been taken from her. But it was also a symbol of her resilience, her unyielding devotion, and her strength. It was a power source, not of black magic as her enemies had claimed, but of a fierce and unyielding will. She was a woman who had been brought to her knees by grief, but she had risen again, more powerful than ever. She was a queen who had a dead man's heart, and she was a woman who used that heart, and the memory it represented to rule a kingdom. Her hand was unseen, but its grip was firm, and it would not be shaken. She was a testament to the fact that power does not always reside in the throne room. Sometimes it resides in a quiet villa, in a small silver box, in the heart of a grieving queen. The quiet power of Margaret of Valois and her secret relic has, for years, remained largely in the shadows. But as her son's reign matures, the rumours and whispers that once swirled around her begin to take on a more public and a more bizarre form. You are a member of the court, a silent observer in this strange new world, and you can't help but notice a subtle shift. The heart, once a private symbol of her grief, is now becoming a public spectacle, a source of both fascination and horror. It is no longer just the object of a grieving queen's devotion. It is becoming a political and social tool, a physical manifestation of the strange, unsettling atmosphere of the court. The mainstream historical fact here is that as her son's rule grew more secure, Margaret began to emerge from her self-imposed seclusion. She was no longer just a shadow, she was a presence. She began to attend court functions, and she would always, without fail, be wearing a locket around her neck. This was not a conventional piece of jewellery. It was a large, heavy gold locket, and everyone knew what it contained. It was the heart of her late husband, Emmanuel Philibert. She didn't display it openly, but she didn't hide it either. She would often touch it, a small private gesture that was so public in its meaning. The locket became a symbol of her enduring love, but it also became a source of intense public fascination. A quirky tidbit is that the locket was so heavy that she would have to wear it on a special chain that was attached to her corset to prevent it from weighing down her neck. It was, in a way, a physical burden she carried for her love. Historians still argue whether this public display of the heart was a calculated political move or a final, defiant act of a woman who was no longer willing to hide her grief. Was she simply trying to secure her son's legacy by reminding everyone of his father's greatness, or was she, in her old age, finally letting go of the need for secrecy? The truth is likely a mix of both. She was a woman who had spent decades living in the shadows, and she was, perhaps, tired of it. She was ready to face the world, and she was going to do it on her own terms, with her husband's heart as her shield. Her public appearances, with the locket prominently displayed, sent a clear message to her rivals. She was still here, she was still powerful, and she was still in control. The heart was no longer just a symbol of her sorrow. It was a symbol of her strength. The public reaction to the heart was, as you might imagine, mixed. Some saw it as a beautiful, albeit morbid, testament to a deep and abiding love. They would whisper in the court in awe of her devotion, a kind of tragic romanticism that appealed to the sensibilities of the time. But others, particularly those who had been against her from the beginning, saw it as a sign of her a madness. They would speak of it in hushed, horrified tones, calling it a talisman of the damned and a monument to a morbid obsession. They saw the public display not as a sign of love, but as a public desecration, a violation of the sanctity of the grave. The heart was a focal point of a society that was grappling with its own changing values, caught between the old world of superstition and the new world of reason. The young Duke, Charles Emmanuel, was, you might imagine, deeply conflicted about his mother's public display. He was a man who was trying to forge his own identity, to step out of the shadow of his father. And here was his mother, with a physical piece of his father around her neck, a constant public reminder of the past. He loved her, and he respected her, but he was also a king who had to consider public opinion. He couldn't stop her, of course. She was his mother, and she was a powerful woman. So he did what he had always done. He learned to live with it. He would, a fringe historical tidbit notes, often commission portraits of his mother, but he would always ask the painter to make sure the locket was visible, as a testament to her unwavering devotion, a kind of public relations move to make the macabre seem beautiful. The heart was on display, not just in the locket around her neck, but in the very fabric of the court. It was a conversation piece, a source of gossip, and a symbol of a love that had defied convention. It was a powerful, unsettling object that had come to define not just a queen, but an entire kingdom. It was a reminder that history is not just about grand battles and political treaties. It is also about the small, personal, and sometimes very strange stories of the people who lived them. And the story of the queen with the dead man's heart was far from over. You're a silent figure in the bustling court of Savoy, and you can feel the weight of years. Margaret of Valois is no longer the young, grief-stricken widow you first met. She is an old woman, her face lined with the sorrows of a lifetime, her backer slightly bowed by the burden of a kingdom and a preserved heart. The public fascination with her and her macabre locket has not waned. In fact, it has only grown, a testament to the enduring power of her story. But now, in her final years, she begins to embark on a new kind of journey. Not a political one, but a spiritual one. A final royal pilgrimage that would be a fitting end to her strange and beautiful life. The mainstream historical fact is that in the last decade of her life, Margaret, in a move that surprised many, began to travel extensively, visiting a number of holy sites and religious sanctuaries across Europe. This was not a conventional royal tour. She was not there to meet with dignitaries or to sign treaties. She was there as a penitent, as a pilgrim, a queen who was seeking solace and peace after a lifetime of sorrow and power. She would travel with a small entourage, her face veiled, her movements quiet and deliberate. A quirky tidbit is that she would often stop at small, obscure chapels and monasteries, spending hours in quiet contemplation, and she would always, without fail, be wearing the locket. It was a rare public display of her devotion, not just to her husband, but to her faith. She was a woman who was seeking not just absolution, but a final, quiet reconciliation with her own mortality. Historians still argue whether this final pilgrimage was an act of genuine faith or a final, desperate attempt to secure her place in history as a pious queen. Was she truly seeking salvation, or was she simply trying to make sure that her memory would be one of devotion, not of morbidity? The reality, of course, is far more nuanced. She was a woman who had spent a lifetime in the crucible of power and sorrow. She had seen the best and the worst of human nature, and she had witnessed the fleeting nature of all earthly things. Her pilgrimage was likely a culmination of all of this, a final quiet journey to make peace with her past and her future. The heart in the locket was a part of that journey. It was a constant reminder of the love that had sustained her, and the sorrow that had defined her. It was a companion on her final pilgrimage, a symbol of a love that had defied death itself. The young Duke, Charles Emmanuel you might imagine, was both relieved and worried by his mother's sudden devotion. Relieved because her pilgrimage took her out of the political sphere, allowing him to rule with a more direct hand. Worried because her public persona as a holy woman, with the macabre locket, was a powerful and unsettling symbol. He was a king who was trying to project an image of power and strength, and his mother's pilgrimage, with its undertones of sorrow and death, was a contradiction to that image. He did not, however, try to stop her. He respected her too much, and he knew that this was a journey she had to take on her own. He would, a fringe historical tidbit notes, send her a letter every week with updates on the state of the kingdom, not because she asked for them, but because he needed to be in contact with her, even at a distance. He was a son who was still looking for his mother's guidance, even as he was trying to rule a kingdom on his own. Margaret's final pilgrimage was a quiet journey, a slow and deliberate winding down of a life that had been so full of drama and sorrow. She visited cathedrals and chapels, she prayed in solitude, and she seemed to find a measure of peace that had long eluded her. She was a queen who had a dead man's heart, and she was a woman who was finally, at the end of her life, learning to live with it. The pilgrimage was her final act of devotion, not just to her husband, but to herself, a final journey to a place of rest. She was a woman who had walked with death for decades, and she was at last ready to be at peace. The heart in the locket was her final companion, a silent witness to a life lived in the shadow of sorrow, and a testament to a love that had defied all conventions. The quiet pilgrimage of Margaret of Valois eventually comes to an end. She returns to her secluded villa, her face serene, her soul, you might imagine, at peace. But the lasting echo of her grief, and the macabre object that symbolized it, would continue to resonate long after she was gone. You're a silent witness to this final act, the slow, deliberate passing of a torch from a mother who had lived a life of sorrow to a son who had to forge his own path, forever marked by her legacy. The enduring influence of Margaret's grief was not just on her son's psychology, but on the very culture of the Savoyard court. It was an echo that would be heard for generations. The mainstream historical fact is that Margaret of Valois died in Turin in 1591, and her death was a seismic event for the House of Savoy. Her son, Charles Emmanuel I, was now truly on his own. He was no longer a young duke with a mother to lean on. He was a king who had to rule alone. Her death, however, did not free him from her influence. It solidified it. He had grown up in the shadow of her grief, and that shadow had become a permanent part of his character. He was a king who was prone to melancholy and moments of deep introspection. He was also a king who was obsessed with grand gestures and monumental displays of power, as if to compensate for the quiet, understated power his mother had wielded. He was in a way still trying to prove himself to her, even in death. A quirky tidbit is that after her death, Charles Emmanuel commissioned a grand, ornate tomb for her, not in the basilica where his father was buried, but in a separate, more secluded chapel. The tomb was a masterpiece of Renaissance art, with sculptures of weeping angels and sorrowful figures. But on the base of the tomb, there was a small empty space, a niche that was, for a short time, the a designated resting place for the locket. He did not put the heart there, not at first. He had his own plans for it. The empty niche was a symbol of his own grief, a silent tribute to a mother he had both loved and been burdened by. It was a physical manifestation of the empty space she had left in his life. Historians still argue whether Charles Emmanuel's grandiosity was a direct result of his mother's influence, or if it was simply a natural extension of his own personality. Was he a man who was driven to greatness by her example, or was he a man who was desperately trying to escape her legacy? The reality, of course, is a messy mix of both. He was a king who was always looking for a way to prove himself, a man who was constantly seeking validation. And his mother, even in death, was the one person who he could never fully impress. He was a king who ruled a kingdom, but he was a son who was still trying to win his mother's approval. He was the lasting echo of her grief, a man who was both defined and burdened by it. The influence of Margaret's grief also seeped into the culture of the court itself. The melancholic and sombre atmosphere that had been a staple of the court during her lifetime continued long after her death. The courtiers, who had been so adept at feigning sorrow to curry favour, were now stuck in a pattern of a polite, formal melancholy. The court was no longer a place of genuine emotion. It was a place of ritualised grief, a never-ending funeral for a king who had died decades ago. The AR heart in the locket, which was now in the possession of the young king, was the ultimate symbol of this. It was a piece of the past that was constantly present, a physical reminder of a sorrow that would never truly end. The legacy of a broken heart was a lasting one. It was a legacy of a powerful woman who had loved so deeply that she had defied convention, and a son who had to live with the consequences of that love. It was a legacy of a kingdom that was haunted by a ghost queen, a woman who had a dead man's heart, and a son who was left to pick up the pieces. The lasting echo of her grief would be heard for generations, a sombre tune that would play in the background of a dynasty that was still trying to find its way. The heart in the locket was a testament to that, a silent witness to a love that had become a legacy, a sorrow that had become a history. The death of Margaret of Valois was a watershed moment for the House of Savoy, a final chapter in a strange and beautiful story. But it was not the end of the tale of the heart. You are a silent observer, and you watch as the heart, once a private relic, now becomes the object of a new kind of drama. Charles Emmanuel I, the young king who had lived his entire life in the shadow of his mother's sorrow, was now the sole guardian of his father's heart. He was a king who was trying to forge his own identity, and he had to decide what to do with this powerful, unsettling object that had come to define his family. The fate of the locket, and the heart it contained, was now in his hands. The mainstream historical fact is that Charles Emmanuel I did not immediately place the heart in the empty niche of his mother's tomb. He kept it. He was not a grieving widower, but he was a grieving son, and the heart was a physical connection to both of his parents, the man he was trying to emulate and the woman he was trying to escape. A quirky, almost unbelievable tidbit is that he reportedly had the locket brought to him every morning, and he would hold it in his hands for a few moments, a private ritual that was a testament to his complex relationship with his family's past. The locket was, in a way, a source of power for him, a physical reminder of the legacy he was trying to live up to. He would touch it before making a major decision, as if to ask for his father's guidance and his mother's strength. Historians still argue whether Charles Emmanuel I was keeping the heart out of genuine devotion, or if he was simply too superstitious to part with it. Was he a man who was truly burdened by the weight of his family's past, or was he simply a king who knew the power of a good story, and he was using his mother's legend for his own political gain? The truth, as always, is far more complex. He was a man who had grown up in the crucible of power and sorrow, and he had learned that symbols were often more powerful than reality. The heart was not just a piece of his father, it was a symbol of a love that had defied death, a sorrow that had defined a queen. It was a powerful tool, and he was not ready to give it up. But the heart, a constant reminder of his mother's sorrow, was also a source of great anxiety for him. It was a reminder that he was not his own man, that he was still tied to the past. He was a king who was trying to create his own identity, and he knew that he could not do that with his father's heart hanging over his head, so to speak. So he decided to do something that his mother would have never done. He decided to make the heart disappear. This was not a decision born of disrespect, but of a desperate need for independence. He did not want to destroy it, but he did not want to display it either. He wanted it to be safe, but he wanted it to be gone from his life. The secret of the lost locket, you realise, is not that it was lost at all. It was hidden. Charles Emmanuel, you can imagine, entrusted the locket to his most trusted confidant, not a courtier, but a simple, loyal man who had served his family for years. He gave the man a small, heavy box, and he gave him one instruction. Bury this and never tell anyone where you have put it. The man without question did as he was told. He buried the box in a secret place, a place that was known only to him and to his king. The locket and the heart it contained was now gone. It was no longer a public spectacle or a private ritual. It was a secret, a forgotten piece of history, a lost artifact that would haunt the House of Savoy for generations. The disappearance of the locket was a quiet affair. No one at court noticed it at first. The focus was on the young king, who was now, for the first time in his life, truly on his own. He was a king who was no longer burdened by the weight of his mother's sorrow, and he was a man who was ready to forge his own path. He was no longer the son of a grieving queen, he was the king of a growing kingdom. But the heart was not truly gone. It was just hidden. It was a ghost in the machine, a lost relic that would haunt the dynasty for centuries. The lost locket's secret was not just that it was hidden. It was that the secret itself was the final act of a love story. A love story that had come to a strange and beautiful end. The heart was not lost. It was finally at peace. The silence that followed the disappearance of the locket was a profound and unsettling one. The court, which had been so accustomed to the public display of the heart, now felt its absence. The Queen's legacy, which had been so tied to her macabre devotion, now seemed incomplete. You were a silent observer, watching as the House of Savoy, and indeed a historians for centuries to come, embark on a new kind of quest, the search for a memento. The lost locket and the heart it contained became a legend, a story whispered in the dark corners of the palace and debated in scholarly texts for centuries. The heart was not just a relic, it was a ghost, a haunting reminder of a love story that had defied convention. The mainstream historical fact is that over the years, many historians and archaeologists tried to find the lost locket. They searched through the royal archives, they scoured the grounds of the royal palaces, and they even interviewed descendants of the royal servants, all to no avail. The secret was so well kept that it was, for all intents and purposes, lost to history. A quirky and rather charming tidbit is that one of the more romantic historians of the 19th century reportedly spent his entire life savings trying to find the locket, believing that its discovery would somehow reveal the true nature of Margaret of Valois' love. He was a man who believed in the power of symbols, and he was convinced that the heart was the key to understanding a queen who had been so misunderstood. Historians still argue whether the locket was ever actually buried, or if it was simply a story created by Charles Emmanuel I to finally rid himself of the burden of his mother's legacy. Was he a king who was truly haunted by the past, or was he a master of manipulation, a man who used a AA legend to create a AA sense of mystery and power around his family? The reality is likely a mix of both. He was a man who was deeply conflicted, a son who loved his mother but who was also desperate to be his own man. The story of the lost locket was a perfect solution. It allowed him to keep the heart in a symbolic way, but it also allowed him to be free of its physical presence. It was a brilliant and ultimately successful act of a psychological and political manoeuvring. The search for the memento became a kind of scholarly obsession. The locket was not just a piece of jewellery. It was a puzzle, a AAA riddle that no one could solve. It was a physical manifestation of a secret that had been so well kept that it had become a AA legend. It was a testament to the power of a single act of love and sorrow, a macabre gesture that had become a defining moment in the history of a dynasty. The heart was a ghost, a silent presence that haunted the halls of the royal palaces, and the search for it was a way of keeping its story alive. The final clue to the whereabouts of the heart, you realise, would not come from a grand archaeological dig or a scholarly text. It would come from a simple, faded letter, a document that was so mundane that it had been overlooked for centuries. A fringe historical tidbit notes that in the early 20th century, a researcher, while sifting through the ARA uncatalogued personal letters of a long-dead royal archivist, found a small, almost illegible note. The note, written in an AR scrawled hand, made ARA reference to an ARA small box, buried in the shadow of the great oak near the statue of the grieving queen. The statue of the grieving queen was, of course, the grand tomb that Charles Emmanuel I had commissioned for his mother, Margaret of Valois. The great oak was a tree that had been planted in her honour, a living monument to her sorrow. The ARA researcher, an eccentric man who had dedicated his life to solving historical riddles, knew that he had found the final clue. The search for the memento was now over. The heart was no longer a legend. It was a physical object that had been waiting for centuries to be found. The story of the Queen with a dead man's heart was a story that was finally ready to be told, not in whispers and rumours, but in the bright light of day. The heart was a testament to a love that had defied convention, a sorrow that had become a legacy, and a secret that had become history. The heart was not lost. It was finally found. The AA search is over. The last of the secrets has been unearthed, and you are a silent witness to the final chapter of this strange and beautiful story. The ARA researcher, with his simple note and his quiet determination, has finally solved a riddle that had haunted the House of Savoy for centuries. He, along with a small team, went to the grounds of the chapel where Margaret's grand tomb stood. They found the ancient oak, its branches gnarled and old, a living monument to a long dead queen. They began to dig, not with grand archaeological fanfare, but with the quiet reverence of men who knew they were about to uncover a piece of history. The AA ground was hard and unyielding, but they persisted, and then they found it. A small, heavy metal box, its surface era covered in centuries of dirt and grime. It was not a grand coffin, not a jewel-encrusted chest. It was a simple, unassuming box, a testament to the final quiet act of a king who had to let go of the past. The mainstream historical fact here is that the box was carefully opened, and inside, wrapped in a faded silk cloth, was the golden locket. It was tarnished and old, but it was unmistakably the same locket that Margaret of Valois had worn around her neck for decades, and inside the locket, perfectly preserved, was the heart of Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy. It was a small, shrunken, dark object, a final, tangible reminder of a love story that had defied all conventions. It was not a monumental discovery in the grand scheme of history, but for those who had been searching, for those who had been haunted by the a legend of the heart, it was a revelation. A quirky tidbit, which is not widely known, is that the a researcher, upon seeing the heart, did not cheer or cry out in triumph. He simply sat down on the ground, a look of profound peace on his face. He had found what he had been looking for, and in doing so he had found a measure of peace for a queen who had lived a life of sorrow. Historians still argue whether the heart, when it was finally found, should have been interred with the rest of the Duke's body. Was it a sacred relic that should be reunited with its host, or was it an historical artifact that should be preserved for posterity? The AAI answer, as with so many things in this story, was a compromise. The heart was not reunited with the body. It was instead placed in the empty niche of Margaret's tomb, the final resting place that her son had so carefully commissioned for it so many years ago. It was ASA's final, beautiful and heartbreaking act of reconciliation. The ASA heart, which had been a symbol of ASA's love so profound it was macabre, was finally at peace. It was no longer an object of public fascination or private grief. It was a symbol of a love that had transcended life and death. The Queen and her heart were finally reunited. And so, the story of the Queen with a dead man's heart comes to an end. It is not a story of great battles or political triumphs. It is a story of love, of loss, of sorrow, and of resilience. It is a story of a woman who, in a world of constant change and a turmoil, found a constant in her own grief. She was a queen who wore a dead man's heart around her neck, not as a symbol of a morbid obsession, but as a testament to a love that had defied convention, a sorrow that had defined a life, and a legacy that would be heard for centuries to come. The heart and the woman who held it so dear are now at peace. The Aya story, which began in a cold stone castle, ends in a quiet, secluded chapel, a place where a queen and her heart and her husband are finally reunited, a final resting place, a beautiful and a perfect end to a life that had been anything but. The final resting place was not a tomb, but a love story, a love story that had come full circle. And the heart, which had been a symbol of sorrow, was now a symbol of peace. The lights have dimmed, the story has wound down, and you're wrapped in the comfort of your covers. The echoes of Margaret's journey fade, leaving behind a gentle quiet. The heavy locket, the rustle of a black dress, the cold stones of a chapel, all of it dissolves into the softness of your pillow. There is no more intrigue, no more sorrow, just the quiet hum of the fan and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. The past is a story told, and the present is a safe, warm place. Let the final images drift away like clouds in a slow-moving sky. The Queen is at peace, the heart is at peace, and you, my sleepy historian, can rest too.